Richard sat at his grand oak desk, the remnants of another long, exhausting day scattered around him. At 58, he had everything a man could want: money, power, the kind of success most people only dream of. But none of it filled the growing emptiness that had settled in his chest since his wife passed away last year. His once orderly life now felt like a series of motions, hollow and without purpose. He stared at the pile of unopened letters in front of him, most of them mundane business correspondence. He absent-mindedly sorted through the envelopes, pushing aside bills and investment reports. It was routine, just another task to fill the quiet hours of his evening. Then, one envelope caught his attention. Unlike the others, this one was personal, his name handwritten on the front in neat, careful script. There was no return address, only his name, Richard Foster. His brow furrowed. He couldn't remember the last time someone had sent him a personal letter. Curiosity got the better of him, and with a flick of his wrist he opened it. The letter inside was brief, but its message was anything but ordinary. Dear Richard, I'm writing to you because I believe we share something much deeper than just a surname. I am Daniel Foster, and I've recently discovered that I am your brother. I know this must come as a shock, but I have been searching for you for many years. I have reason to believe that our parents, for reasons I don't yet fully understand, gave me up for adoption. I would like to meet you and explain everything in person. Please consider reaching out. Sincerely, Daniel Foster. Richard's hands froze, his mind racing to catch up with the words he had just read. A brother? He had no memory of ever hearing about another sibling, no mention of a Daniel. Could this be a scam? A scheme by someone trying to worm their way into his life and, more importantly, his fortune? He set the letter down and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling as questions swirled. Despite his initial suspicion, there was something unsettling about the letter. Daniel's claim wasn't outrageous, but it was personal. Too personal. The letter didn't ask for anything. It wasn't about money. It was simply a plea for connection. And there was something else. A faint memory buried in the back of his mind, one he couldn't quite place. He shook his head, trying to dismiss the strange feeling that was creeping over him. But as he reached for another letter from the pile, his thoughts kept drifting back to the one he had just read. It bothered him more than he wanted to admit. Setting aside his paperwork, Richard stood up and walked to the large window overlooking the estate grounds. The lights of the city glimmered in the distance, but they seemed so far removed from the turmoil inside him. His parents had always been distant, emotionally reserved. They rarely talked about the past or family, and now he wondered if there was a reason for that silence. Richard rubbed his temples, feeling the familiar tension creeping in. This was nonsense, he told himself. A scam, an error, something insignificant. Yet the letter had shaken something loose inside him, an uncomfortable mix of doubt and curiosity. With a deep sigh, he returned to his desk, folded the letter, and placed it in a drawer. For now, he would put it out of his mind. He had more pressing things to worry about than chasing after ghosts from the past. But even as he tried to move on, the thought of the letter lingered at the edge of his mind, refusing to be forgotten. The letter stayed in Richard's desk drawer for days, but it never tea. Every time he sat down to handle business or sift through the monotony of daily paperwork, the thought of Daniel lingered. The nagging feeling, the questions he tried to suppress, only grew louder. One evening, as the house settled into its familiar silence, Richard found himself standing in front of the desk once again. He opened the drawer and pulled out the letter, rereading it for what felt like the 100th time. Daniel Foster. Brother. The more he thought about it, the less it made sense. His parents had never spoken about any other children. Richard had been their only son, the center of their world, or so he'd always believed. But the letter was so specific, so sincere. He couldn't ignore it anymore. That night he decided to dig into his family's past. He went up to the attic, a place he rarely visited anymore. It was cluttered with relics from a different time, his parents' old belongings, and boxes he had never bothered to open after their deaths. He sorted through dusty old furniture, photo albums, and brittle papers, searching for anything that might hold a clue. After hours of searching, He found a small, unmarked box tucked away in a corner. It looked unimportant, but something about it drew his attention. He carefully opened it and was greeted by a set of old documents, birth certificates, legal papers, letters. His heart raced as he flipped through the contents, and then his breath caught in his throat. There, folded between a stack of official-looking papers, was an adoption certificate. The name listed was Daniel Foster. Richard stared at the document, his mind reeling. It was real. His parents had another son, a son they had given away. He felt a strange mix of emotions. Anger at his parents for keeping the secret, confusion about why they would have done such a thing, and sadness for a brother he never knew existed. He sat down on an old chair, his head spinning. All those years, all the dinners, the family holidays. Had his parents ever thought about Daniel? Had they ever regretted their decision? He couldn't imagine his life being so drastically altered by such a hidden truth. But that was the reality he now faced. Daniel must have been given up when his parents were much younger, at a time when they were likely struggling. The thought of his parents, cold and stoic as they were, making such a choice made Richard uneasy. There had always been something distant about them, something they never talked about. Perhaps this was it, the burden they had carried in silence. Richard carefully put the papers back into the box and returned to his desk downstairs. He placed the box next to the letter and sat there, staring at both of them. What now? He had always prided himself on being a man of action, decisive and efficient, but this was different. This was personal, and he wasn't sure how to move forward. His phone sat on the desk, taunting him. He had Daniel's contact information now, included at the bottom of the letter. He could call, set up a meeting, and find out more about this mysterious brother. But a part of him was still hesitant. What if this changed everything? What if meeting Daniel brought more pain than closure? Yet deep down, Richard knew he couldn't just ignore it. He needed answers. After a long pause, he picked up the phone and dialed the number. It rang several times before a voice answered, slightly uncertain but hopeful. "Hello, this is Daniel." Richard's throat tightened. He wasn't used to this, reaching out to strangers, opening himself up to vulnerability. But there was no turning back now. "This is Richard Foster," he said, his voice steady but low. "I got your letter." There was a brief silence on the other end, followed by a soft intake of breath. "I didn't know if you would call," Daniel said, his tone filled with a mixture of relief and caution. "I'm sure this is a lot to take in." "You could say that," Richard replied, feeling the weight of understatement in his own words. He took a deep breath and continued. "I found the papers, the adoption. So I suppose it's true." "Yes," Daniel said, his voice tinged with sadness. "I've known for a while, but I wasn't sure how to reach out. I didn't want to disrupt your life, but I had to know." Richard's heart pounded in his chest. A part of him wanted to hang up, retreat back into the safe, controlled life he had built for himself. But another part, a stronger part, told him that this was important. This was something he needed to face. "I'm not sure what this all means yet," Richard said, his voice quieter now. "But I'd like to meet you. We should talk." Daniel's voice brightened with cautious optimism. "I'd like that, whenever you're ready." Richard glanced at the clock. "Tomorrow. Let's meet tomorrow." After they exchanged details, Richard hung up, feeling a strange sense of relief mixed with apprehension. He didn't know what to expect, but he had taken the first step. Tomorrow, his life could change forever. The following afternoon, Richard found himself sitting in a small cafe far removed from the high-end restaurants and exclusive clubs he usually frequented. The place was modest, almost quaint, with worn wooden tables and the smell of freshly brewed coffee filling the. It was the kind of spot where no one would recognize him, and that's exactly what he needed: anonymity. He glanced at his watch for the third time, noting that he had arrived early. His mind buzzed with thoughts of what this meeting would bring. He didn't know what kind of man Daniel was or if he could trust him. What if this meeting was some elaborate ploy? The rational part of him wanted to stay guarded, to protect himself. But another part of him, one he hadn't listened to in a long time, hoped this meeting would offer something he couldn't quite define. A connection, maybe even closure. The door of the cafe jingled softly as it opened, and Richard looked up. He had a worn jacket, jeans that had seen better days, and a nervous energy about him. As their eyes met, Richard knew immediately. This was Daniel. Daniel approached the table slowly, his eyes searching Richard's face for any sign of recognition or acceptance. He gave a tentative smile, and Richard nodded, gesturing for him to sit. The silence between them felt heavy, thick with the weight of the unknown. Daniel sat across from Richard, his hands clasped together on the table as if he were trying to keep himself grounded. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. "It's strange, isn't it?" Daniel finally broke the silence, his voice soft. "Meeting like this, after all this time." Richard nodded, unsure of what to say. He had prepared questions, scenarios, but now, sitting face to face with the man who claimed to be his brother, words seemed harder to find. "You look a lot like him," Daniel said, glancing at Richard's features. "Like our father." Richard stiffened slightly at the mention of his father. His parents, always a source of quiet pride, now felt like a puzzle with missing pieces. "I didn't know we had a resemblance, Daniel smiled faintly. "Neither did I until I started looking into things. It's been a long journey to find you, Richard." Richard leaned forward slightly, his curiosity finally overcoming his hesitation. "Why now? Why reach out after all these years?" Daniel sighed, rubbing the back of his neck before answering. "I've known about you for a while. After our parents passed, I found some documents. Things they didn't want to talk about, I suppose. I was adopted by a family in another state, but I always felt like something was missing. I didn't know what, not until I found those papers." Richard studied Daniel's face, trying to make sense of the man in front of him. His instinct was to be suspicious, to protect himself from being hurt or manipulated, but there was something raw, something undeniably sincere in Daniel's expression. He wasn't here for money or fame, he was searching for family. "And what exactly do you expect to happen now?" Richard asked, his voice quieter than before. "We meet and what? We go our separate ways?" "I don't know," Daniel admitted. "I didn't come here with an agenda. I wanted to know you, to understand why our parents gave me up, to fill in the blanks, I guess." The word blanks resonated with Richard. He had lived his whole life thinking he had the full picture of who his parents were, of what his family was. Now sitting here, he realized that his past had been carefully curated, the truth hidden beneath layers of silence. Daniel hesitated for a moment before reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small leather-bound diary and placed it gently on the table between them. "This," Daniel said, his voice thick with emotion, "belonged to our mother. I found it among the papers. I thought you might want to read it." Richard stared at the diary, unsure of how to react. The object felt like it was burning a hole in the table, its presence too powerful to ignore. The idea that his mother had left something behind, a piece of her thoughts and feelings, unsettled him. What could she have written? What could explain giving up one child and keeping the other? "What's in it?" Richard asked, his eyes fixed on the small book. "It's her thoughts. About us. About her life. She wrote about the decision to give me up, how difficult it was. She never stopped thinking about, I've read it, but I think it's something you should see too." Richard swallowed hard, his emotions swirling in a way that made him uncomfortable. He wasn't used to this, to being vulnerable, to confronting feelings he had long since buried. But now, with this diary in front of him, he felt like he had no choice. The past was coming back, and he had to face it. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," Richard admitted quietly. Daniel nodded, understanding. "I didn't expect you to be, but it's here if you ever want to read it." They sat in silence again, both men lost in their thoughts. The tension between them was still there, but it had shifted. no longer fueled by suspicion, but by the weight of what they had both missed out on. "I'll think about it," Richard said, finally breaking the silence. Daniel gave a soft smile, his eyes filled with something Richard hadn't expected. Hope. "That's all I ask." Richard left the cafe with the diary tucked under his arm, the weight of it pulling down on him like an anchor. He had agreed to take it, but the thought of opening it filled him with a mix of dread and curiosity. The idea that his mother had written about Daniel, about her life, and kept it all hidden from him. It was a wound he wasn't sure he was ready to face. Back at home, he placed the diary on his desk, unopened, as if it were a bomb waiting to go off. He poured himself a drink and sat down, staring at the book for what felt like hours. His mind swirled with questions. What would the pages reveal about the mother he thought he knew, about the father he had idolized? Eventually, the silence in the room became too much. With a deep breath, Richard reached for the diary and slowly opened the worn leather cover. The handwriting inside was delicate, familiar, and it tugged at something deep inside him. As he began to read, his mother's voice seemed to come alive in the words on the page. "February 5th, I can hardly believe I'm writing this. Today we made the hardest decision of our lives. We gave Daniel away. I feel like I've lost a part of myself. I don't know how I'll ever recover from this, but we had no choice. We weren't ready. We couldn't take care of him." Richard paused, his heart pounding. He turned the page, reading on as his mother described the financial difficulties she and his father faced when they were young, the pressures of trying to build a stable life, and the painful decision to put Daniel up for adoption. She spoke of their regrets, their hopes that he would find a better life with another family. "I know I'll never stop thinking about him, but we have to focus on the future. One day and we'll be ready. We'll be able to give him everything we couldn't give." Richard closed the book for a moment, feeling a wave of emotions wash over him. His parents had loved Daniel. They had struggled, made the hardest decision imaginable, and then tried to move forward. And yet they had never told Richard about any of it. They had carried this burden in silence, creating a life for him that felt whole, but was missing a crucial piece. His hands trembled slightly as he reopened the diary, continuing to read the pages filled with his mother's inner turmoil. She wrote about the guilt she carried, how she had tried to convince herself they had done the right thing, but there was always a hole in her heart. Richard read entry after entry, seeing his parents in a way he never had before, not as the strong, unshakable figures of his childhood, but as young, vulnerable people who had made mistakes and suffered for them. Toward the end of the diary, his mother's writing grew more sporadic, less detailed, but the pain was still palpable in her words. December 12, 1992. "Richard is growing up so fast. He's everything we hoped for, but I still think of Daniel. I wonder what kind of man he's become if he ever thinks of us. I wish I could have both my sons here with me. But we made our choice, and now we live with it." Richard set the diary down, unable to read any further. His chest felt tight, and he found himself standing up, pacing the room, trying to process everything he had just learned. His parents had kept this secret for his entire life, and now he was left to deal with the fallout. How could they have hidden something so important? How could they have allowed him to grow up never knowing the truth about his family? The anger simmered beneath the surface, but it was quickly tempered by something else, a deep, overwhelming sadness. His parents were gone, and now he would never be able to ask them why. He would never get the answers he so desperately wanted. All he had were the words in the diary, and they only told part of the story. The following day, Richard called Daniel. "I read it," he said without preamble. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "I wasn't sure if you would." "I did," Richard continued, his voice steady but tinged with emotion. "And I think we need to talk about everything." Daniel agreed, and they arranged to meet again, this time at Richard's estate. When Daniel arrived, there was an undeniable tension in the air. Richard led him into his study, where the diary still lay open on the desk. "I had no idea," Richard said, breaking the silence. "They never told me." They never even hinted at it. Daniel nodded, his eyes flicking to the diary. I've had more time to come to terms with it, but I know how hard it must be for you. Richard stared out the window. It's not just hard. It's like everything I thought I knew about them was a lie. They gave you away, and they kept it from me. I think they were trying to protect you, Daniel said gently. They wanted to give you the life they couldn't give me. Richard turned to face him, a mixture of anger and sadness in his eyes. But they still loved you. I can see that in the diary. They thought about you. They regretted it. They did, Daniel agreed. But it doesn't change the fact that and we have to live with that. The room fell silent again, both men lost in their thoughts. The weight of the past hung heavily between them, but there was also a sense of understanding beginning to form. Richard could see that Daniel wasn't trying to take anything from him. He was just searching for the same thing Richard was: answers, closure, a chance to move forward. I don't know where this leaves us, Richard said after a long pause. But I'm willing to try. To get to know you. Daniel smiled, relief evident in his expression. That's all I've ever wanted. A few days later, Richard found himself standing at the entrance of the cemetery where his parents were buried. He had visited this place many times before, but today felt different. Today, he wasn't just paying respects to his parents. He was confronting the truth they had hidden for so long. Daniel stood beside him, both men quiet as they took in the somber surroundings. The cool breeze rustled the leaves of the trees, and the faint sounds of the city seemed to fade away, leaving only the stillness of the cemetery. Richard felt the weight of the diary in his jacket pocket, a constant reminder of the secrets that had brought them here. Are you ready? Daniel asked softly, breaking the silence. Richard nodded, though he wasn't entirely sure. He had been dreading this moment ever since they decided to come here together, but he knew it was necessary. They walked slowly down the path toward the family plot, the headstones standing like silent witnesses to the years of untold history. When they reached the graves, Richard paused, his eyes scanning the familiar sight of his parents' names etched into the marble. It felt surreal, knowing that the people he had loved, the people who had raised him, had carried such a painful secret to their graves. For a few moments, neither of them spoke. Richard stood there trying to gather his thoughts, trying to make sense of everything he had learned. The anger and betrayal he had felt were still there, but they were mixed with a deep sadness that he couldn't shake. They loved you, Daniel said quietly, as if sensing Richard's inner turmoil. You were their son, and they did everything they could for you. Richard's jaw tightened, and they gave you away. Daniel nodded, his expression somber but understanding. Yes, but that doesn't mean. You saw it in the diary. They thought about me. They regretted it. Richard took a deep breath and pulled the diary out of his pocket. He opened it to one of the final entries and began to read aloud, his voice steady but filled with emotion. I wish I could have both my sons here with me, but we made our choice, and now we live with it. His voice faltered as the words hit him harder than he had expected. He had read them before, but standing here, at the graves of his parents, they felt heavy. His mother had lived with this regret for years, and now it was up to him to carry that burden and to find a way to move past it. Richard closed the diary and looked at Daniel, who was watching him with a mixture of sadness and understanding. I'm sorry, Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm sorry for everything, for not knowing, for not being there. Daniel shook his head. You didn't know. None of this is your fault. We were both victims of the same decision. Richard nodded, grateful for Daniel's forgiveness but still grappling with the weight of the past. He looked down at the graves again, feeling the need to say something more. To his parents, to the memory of the family he thought he knew. I don't know if I can ever fully forgive them, he admitted, but I can try. I can try to understand. Daniel placed a hand on his shoulder, a quiet gesture of support. That's all any of us can do. Try. For the first time since receiving the letter, Richard felt a small sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't full closure. There was still too much to process, too many emotions to work through. But it was a start. He had found a brother he never knew he had, and together, they were beginning to heal the wounds left by their parents' choices. They stood there for a few more moments, both lost in their thoughts, before Richard finally spoke again. "Thank you," he said, turning to Daniel, for giving me a chance to know the truth." Daniel smiled, a genuine warmth in his expression. "I'm glad you gave me a chance too." With that, they turned and walked back down the path, leaving the graves behind. But as they left the cemetery, Richard felt something lift inside him, something that had been weighing him down for years, even if he hadn't realized it. The past was still there, but it no longer held the same power over him. Now, he could begin to move forward. The next few weeks passed quietly, but the impact of Richard and Daniel's meeting at the cemetery rippled through Richard's life in ways he hadn't expected. The tension that had weighed him down for so long began to ease, and for the first time in years, Richard felt like he was beginning to understand his own family. He hadn't just gained a brother, he'd gained perspective on the choices his parents had made, and slowly, he was starting to forgive them. It wasn't an easy process, but the more time he spent with Daniel, the more he realized they were both carrying the same weight, and together, they could finally begin to let it go. One bright afternoon, Richard invited Daniel to his estate, hoping to take their growing bond to the next step. His house, with its sprawling gardens and luxurious interiors, had always felt too big, too empty. But today, for the first time in a long while, it felt like a home ready to welcome someone new. When Daniel arrived, Richard greeted him at the door with a smile. There was still a quiet awkwardness between them, but it was softer now, more like two people slowly getting used to the idea of being family. "I'm glad you could make it," Richard said, leading Daniel through the wide hallways toward the living room. The house, usually filled with silence, seemed warmer with Daniel's presence. "I'm glad to be here," Daniel replied, looking around at the polished wood floors and high ceilings. "It's a lot to take in." Richard chuckled. "I suppose it is, but I'd like to think we'll get used to it, to all of this." They sat down in the living room, the sunlight filtering through the large windows, casting a soft glow over the room. A small table in front of them held a few old photo albums, something Richard had deliberately left out in the open. "I wanted to show you something," Richard said, gesturing toward the albums. "I've been looking through these lately. Photos of our parents. I thought, maybe we could look through them together." Daniel hesitated for a moment, then smiled. "I'd like that." They opened the first album, flipping through pages of black and white photos of their parents, smiling in front of their first house, standing together at family gatherings, and later holding Richard as a baby. Daniel's eyes lingered on the photos of their father, studying the man who had given him up but had remained such a mystery. "I never got to know him," Daniel said quiet, "but I feel like I'm learning more about him now, through you." Richard nodded, feeling a pang of sadness. "I didn't know everything either. I thought I did, but we've both learned more than we expected." They continued flipping through the albums, sharing stories and memories, some old, some new. As they talked, Richard realized that this was what he had been missing all along. It wasn't just about the photos or the history. It was about the connection, the bond between brothers that had been. By the time they finished going through the albums, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the room. Richard stood up and walked over to the window, gazing out at the expansive gardens beyond. Daniel joined him, and for a moment, they stood side by side, taking in the peaceful scene. "I think our parents would have wanted this," Richard said, his voice soft. "For us to find each other. For us to be a family." Daniel nodded, his gaze steady. "I think so too," There was a long pause, comfortable this time, as they stood together in quiet reflection. The journey they had started, what had begun with a letter from a stranger, had brought them to this moment where they could begin to heal, to rebuild something they hadn't even known was broken. "I know this is still new," Richard said, turning to face Daniel. "But I want you to know, I'm ready to be your brother, to get to know you better, to make up for all the lost time." Daniel smiled, a genuine warmth spreading across his face. "That's all I've ever wanted." As the last of the sunlight disappeared behind the horizon, Richard felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. The past, with all its pain and secrets, would always be a part of him. But now, he had something more, a chance at a new beginning, with a brother he never knew he had. "Let's not waste any more time," Richard said, clapping Daniel on the shoulder. "We've got a lot of life left to live." If you enjoyed this story about family, forgiveness, and second chances, click the card above to watch more stories like this one. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, and leave a comment. I love reading your thoughts, and I can't wait to hear what you think about this journey. Take care.